This series is brought to you by my beloved patrons and YouTube members. G'day guys, welcome back to my Cities Skylines model train set. In the last episode, we worked on the CBD of Sully, and for the most part, I feel like it is pretty much complete, give or take a couple of extra buildings just to redefine the skyline ever so slightly. But for a series that is inspired by model train sets, we didn't really focus too much on the train side of things. So today, let's make up for that. This is going to be a pretty big rail-focused episode as we work on the shorefront of Sully, working alongside this harbour and wharves, and a main central station that will serve the passenger service coming into the city and beyond. This is a lot of work, but I did have a pretty good idea and a good reference of what I was going to be building. So this is Newcastle in the 1940s. Now, I don't really want to be doing exactly what's down here, but this did give me a pretty good starting point. Something that I love seeing is the connection between all this rail infrastructure and then the wharves that then transport all these goods elsewhere. It is also really fascinating just thinking about how all this has changed over time and how Newcastle has very much changed the waterfront along here. It is now pretty much all residential, and these big rail yards and industrial blocks, a lot of them just parks. And I wonder whether or not people even realize that all this was once here. It is all just so fascinating, and I could spend hours flipping between the map and Google Earth and just imagining how this city has changed over time. Although, probably not the best use of my time. I think building it would be a better use. And easy with this map, right? Well, unfortunately, as you're going to find out, not really. The first thing I wanted to do was place down the main central station for Sully. This is going to be the passenger service that's going to be getting people in and out of the city, and I was really keen to use this new train station by Ernesto, fairly recent of his, and it is mighty fine as all of his creations, so I'm actually going to call this whole region along the waterfront Ernesto. I feel like that is a pretty perfect fit for a little area like this. Unfortunately though, can't really say the same about the station. Yes, it is the perfect fit, and it's nothing against the station. It's more my own little hang-ups on a couple of things that were bothering me. First of all, I had to make it a little bit sunken down just so it would fit underneath this bridge. However, it did take away from the grandness of this clock tower, which I felt like needed to stay grand, nice and tall. So a solution would be to turn this building into a procedural object, and then I could actually just modify that clock tower so it was a little taller, but unfortunately using procedural objects mod on this building did just turn it into a little tiny triangle. So I needed to come up with a new solution. The real issue was the bridge. I needed enough clearance so that we had enough space for trains to go underneath it, but then I also didn't want to make the bridge too tall. It felt like it needed to be somewhat on the smaller side of things, but in my pursuits to make it all fit together, I did go a little bit too large, using procedural objects on the bridge just to make it a bit bigger, and then also raising them up just didn't feel right. I didn't really like the fact that the bridge went over the station part, like all the platforms. I didn't really like that, it felt a bit unrealistic, and even dragging out some of the train lines just to get a bit of a feel for where everything's going to fit in. It still just wasn't it. I felt like I needed to rethink about how this would have been developed over a long period of time. And that can be tough when you are doing a little bit of backwards mapping, when you know what the finished product is more or less going to look like, and then you have to try and imagine what was here beforehand. I'm using a lot of really great references, these photos from Newcastle in the 1940s, which, yeah, it's a little bit earlier on. You know, we are kind of basing this in the 1950s and 60s, but I just really like the waterfront here. I think it's just really nice and industrial with this train line running along it. And then this train station too. I feel like this whole thing is just, this is like a real vibe down here, and I really wanted to try and capture at least the essence of it. But as you're going to find out, we are going to be doing a lot of different things down here as well. So I did a lot of experimenting with where the bridge can sit and how it's going to be stretching across the river, the different sizes of this thing, and also just playing around with some of the roads that are stretching down towards it. It was honestly a bit of a stretch. I was having a lot of difficulty just trying to figure out all of it. Mostly to do with the bridge, mostly to do with how it all interacts with the elevation of the land, the roads, the station, all of it. It was very complicated to work out, but Sure enough, after a little bit of trial and error and a lot of experimenting where things can fit, I eventually came up with this design, which is essentially what I started off with some tweaks. For starters, I do have this nice little stone bridge with these two arches going over the top of this rail line, which I do really love. All of this is of course going to be for freight, which is coming in and out of the city, and we'll dive into how all this works in just a little while. And as I continued to tinker and figure out how all of this was going to look, all of the lines coming into the station and how they could be interacting with one another, which is always a bit of fun, but then also a bit of a struggle as well. Because ultimately, I don't really know exactly what I'm doing here. You know, I've got the basic ideas and the basic knowledge of how trains work, but when it comes down to it, I really do not. I figured if I was going to go any further with all of this, I really needed to make sure that this was somewhat accurate and I was following somewhat of a plan that did make a bit of sense. What I needed was a train guy. I got in touch with Capen, who has been giving me some pretty solid advice about all things steam trains in New South Wales, and he came up with a pretty good plan. Using a lot of the infrastructure that I've already got down here, we came up with the idea to include what is a fair few extra train lines, most of which are going to be for the freight yards. They're going to be serving a couple of the different industries that we have, but that was the general plan, and with that, it was time to get back to building. Now, Capen went into far more detail than I ever could, and there's only a certain amount of detail that I am really going to put into all this. It is still going to be fairly surface level, and that's mostly just to save time. As I was saying to Capen, there is only a certain amount of time that I can truly spend on detailing areas like this, and as you're going to find out in just a little while, I do go into actual detail work in terms of trees and adding in roads and decals and all that sort of stuff. I feel like that is where my forte is, and that's where I feel like I am the most at home. And that is also where I honestly want to be spending most of my time trying to figure out, and that's why it's really helpful to have people to get advice about how trains actually work in scenarios like this. Jay, aka Bisquiggle Housing, is also someone I talk to quite a lot, just trying to get an idea of how a lot of these sort of areas work, because yeah, once again, not a train guy, just a train appreciator. So I am just excited just to get into some of the detail and really figure out how all this is going to look in terms of making it look realistic. But in terms of how it's going to operate, I really hope that it is somewhat accurate, because as you're going to find out as well, I do go a bit astray from the original plan, and that's mostly because I found myself straying from the original sources of inspiration, and there is like one picture in particular that I feel like is just the most interesting, and I would like to have, you know, obviously not going to do exactly what's going on down here, but I would love to have a lot of nods and the general vibe of all of this. So I did want to make sure that I was sticking to a bit of the plan and doing a bit of a merge between Capen's idea, which he did get a lot more inspiration from Darling Harbour, which I do also really love, and I do plan to build something as complex and interesting as Darling Harbour back in the 1950s, which would be just a really interesting build, a bunch of builds. But for this build, I did have a couple of other ideas in mind. So this is going to be me figuring out the general idea of how all the rail lines are going to look down here, and then I'm going to be getting into the detail work on the area around the station, all this freight service and all the cargo and all the industry that'll sit around here. That'll be installments as we continue to work around the waterfront of Sully, Amesto, I should call it. But then also, I do want to wait until we do have some trains that are going to be a lot more accurate for this area and for the time period and for Australia in general, because I am only using what I'm finding on the Steam Workshop. I do have a train that is in commission at the moment and is being worked on, but all that takes a really long time, and the original idea was actually to have all the trains created for this series so that we did actually have a whole bunch of unique and accurate trains that are for Australia and for this particular time period. However, I am straying away from that idea. I like the idea of having some, and I will continue to get some made for the series, and in particular, we'll actually get some freight cars made for this series, which I think will add a lot. But in terms of the actual locomotives, I am also going to grab some from the Steam Workshop, and even if they are American or even if they are European, I still would like to use them. And the reason why I'm choosing to do that is I like the idea. First of all, there are just some amazing models that people have made. I haven't truly committed to them just yet because I feel like they're just not pulling the right cargo, and they just got a couple of words in there. You know, some of them have got Kansas City on them, and I'm like, I don't really want Kansas City trains rolling around. Even if the font is like super tiny and you can barely read it, I'm still like, But I'm gonna get some liveries made from working with the same asset creator, and I'm going to also be working on just making some of the carriages and the freight being pulled. That'll be more accurate for this series as well. But I also think that embracing the model train aspect of it all, and even Thomas, our original inspiration too, I do think that having some trains that are not totally accurate doesn't hurt. But I think that having some custom liveries would be amazing. And getting the freight load is also pretty important. So I'm going to continue to work on that. That is happening behind the scenes. And then based on your feedback, I'm also going to make them dummy trains. So rather than truly transporting freight to and from different stations throughout the city and around the whole map, instead they're going to be just transporting nothing. And I think that's going to be far better in terms of making sure that we actually have the right freight going to the right stations. And I also like the idea that at some point, I'm going to know all the routes of all these trains and familiarize myself with where they sit on the map. And I just think that'd be really interesting too. So just keep that in mind. Any feedback, by the way, please let me know, because I do really appreciate all your comments. Once again, not a train guy, so it is always really nice seeing people get in touch and let me know if they've got any suggestions for where things can sit and how it all can fit together and work and be somewhat realistic. Keyword, somewhat. Cities are weird. There's going to be oddities no matter what. And if you see something that seems a bit odd or a little bit weird, let me know and tell me how can we make it make sense. With the layout now complete, I felt like it was time to start getting into some of the detail work, and this is, once again, where I feel really at home and I absolutely love this process. At first, I started to add in a retaining wall which was running alongside the station, which I feel like works really nicely around here, and this was always the plan. But I feel like the thing that makes the biggest difference are the trees. And I was trying not to go too heavy in terms of larger trees. I mentioned this a little while ago, but I always really love seeing how much trees have grown throughout the years. Walking around Sydney or anywhere in Australia, and you always see these large trees around the city. But a lot of old photos, a lot of the trees pretty much are non-existent, or they are much, much smaller. And I do follow a page on Instagram, which is Sydney before and after, or then and now. And one of the biggest differences are the trees. So always enjoy seeing stuff like this. So try not to go too heavy in terms of large trees, but little bushes and little patches of green just coming through some of the gravel, I feel like is adding in so much. And I'm actually going to a lot of detail down here. As you can see, we've got a bit of an access road and leading towards some sheds. Just love this process so much, and it gives me a good idea of how I can detail these areas in the future. You know, this is one of the first ones that I'm putting together. I did do the one for the coal line, which is over at Port Pennington. So I've had practice, but I am still figuring out what assets I have and what I can do in terms of trying to make these places look and feel realistic. And then once I have figured out the general idea behind some of these train yards, I can actually just use the eyedrop tool to basically just pick anything that I've already previously placed down or dragged out, or any of the decals. It is such a useful tool, and it does give you a couple of suggestions for things that are similar or within the same realm of ideas. So I do also really love that. So just an awesome addition. But basically, I'm just going through and adding in little bushes here and there, little weeds, puddle decals, fences, piles of rubbish, you name it. Just trying to find anything that would feel somewhat meant to be there. It is a little bit difficult because you don't always know what sits around these areas, but again, just looking at reference ideas and trying to get a good sense of how train lines look there's a bit of clutter, a lot of little bushes and tufts of grass just stick out throughout all these areas. So you might think I'm going a little bit heavy in terms of little weeds and bushes, but no, this is fairly realistic. And then I've also placed down some of these lamps, which I've seen a couple of pictures, so they do exist. Lamps like this do exist in train yards, but I don't know, they could also not exist. Like maybe they only exist in some places. I don't know, you let me know. And something that probably might be a bit of a stretch are these power lines, which are connecting all of them up. But man, I think they look really nice. And they just add another layer of detail. And I mean that in extra, but then also a layer on top. I needed something up there. And this whole area I think is looking really nice. I am looking forward just to seeing a little steam train rolling through it. And I'll have to just get a couple of little ones just for show, just so we can see what it looks like. But I was bothered by the retaining wall that was up here. Felt like it was a little out of place. So I removed him and instead just added in a bunch of little bushes and a couple of larger trees. But I will remove some of those large trees because they do feel a little bit out of place. They're probably just a bit too big. Again, trees grow over time and these areas didn't really have a huge amount in terms of these larger guys. But yeah, they will eventually grow into some nice large gum trees. But for now, they're just little bushes as a bit of a barrier between the station and that little train yard. I also wanted to make it so that we had a little ramp going down to this bit of an awkward space. I thought that this would be a good little parking spot, but I am still trying to figure out if we need more parking around this station or whether or not I'm just thinking with 2025 brain. I'm not quite sure. You let me know, but it is set in the 50s, so parking should probably be more of a thing, but then also not that many people drove, so perhaps this is the right amount. With the station lower than street level, I did need to make some adjustments to how the front entrance is going to look, and I was able to hide a lot of that sunken station by just dragging out a surface pavement just to cover it all up, and that worked pretty well because now it just looks like some of the windows that were there before on the second level looks like they're now the entrance. So it was starting to look pretty good. However, I was bothered by an overarching problem. The roads were bothering me. They were a little bit awkward. I like some of those triangle blocks, but I probably had a few too many. Particularly at the front of the station, we needed to figure out how this was going to look. I think that the overall layout of the city was a little awkward, and I didn't like these two main roads that were stretching from this little fork in the road. It felt a little bit unusual. And I think that this makes a bit more sense. At least in my mind, it gives me a little bit more to work with. But of course, we have made some problems down here now, and a couple of them are looking a little bit awkward as well. So we do have to make it look a little less awkward. Let's do that. For the block at the front of the station, I decided to dedicate all this land for a big city park. Felt like we needed something along these lines, and I will end up extending it across the road towards where the water's edge is. And for the most part, I do feel like this park is pretty much complete, and we'll have to add in a couple of extra bits and pieces here and there. But for now, I just wanted to work on this block down here, just adding in this building that you can see me placing down, and just working on a bit of the detail work around this area. I wanted it to look really nice because it's a bit of a focal point. So it is kind of an important part of the city that I do want to add in that amount of detail. So I am adding in those things down there. And for this spot, I felt like we needed to build something like this. So I am placing down these buildings and then just doing a little bit of detail work just to merge it into all this space, which I feel like is coming together pretty nicely. And then moving on to over here and building some stuff. Okay. I don't even know what you guys are looking at right now. I was meant to build all this tomorrow, but I've had to just do some real quick rescheduling as my son is sick. So I am looking after him tomorrow rather than finishing off this build, and I'll just lay down this commentary for the outro right now. But I'm sure you are looking at something I'm going to build in like 4 hours time when everyone goes to bed. But regardless, I do know though that I am going to add in some sort of steam train, right? Can you see something on screen? Wonderful. Good on you, $2. So like I mentioned before, this is just a bit of a placeholder until we start getting in some custom trains to actually get in and out of all this, which I think will look really lovely at some point. But for now, we've just got whatever I can find on the Steam Workshop, which is pretty close, and we'll have to add in something a bit more custom later on. But for the passenger service, I do know exactly what I'm going to be using. This is the SAR 520 class. I honestly can't ask for anything better. This is exactly what I want. So this is going to be the main passenger service of Awdry Island, and it's going to be transporting a lot of people around probably all the island or maybe just the major cities, but I am really happy with this. So that's why I wanted to focus on the central station today, because this is a service that I already know is going to be pretty much staying as it is. And I feel like it already has so much personality. It's already got a real look to it, which is exactly what I want for pretty much all the services rolling around the island. Now, you might be asking yourself the question, $2, you've got yourself a central station, you've got the passenger service, but essentially serves no one. Well, what if I told you there is another station? But that's a story for another time. Thank you all so much for watching today's episode of my Cities Skylines model train set. It is very much appreciated. And sorry, I feel like I am rushing towards the end of this episode. I had a little bit more planned, but unfortunately did have to cut it a little bit short, as I explained before. But I do feel like the build turned out pretty nice, and I am really excited to continue working on all this area. I want to give a special shout out to some of my beloved YouTube members and patrons for supporting the channel and making videos like this possible. Avind, Braced Lava, Cappy3, Jack Hawkins, Mikal, Daniel Lawson, Capen97, Homemade Cook, Bravid, Alex White, Avia, Colin Griffith, and Moiti. Cheers legends, catch you all on the next one.